Good evening. Good evening. Tonight is our last session. Is our last session for the course White House Communications from the Perspective of Officials and Reporters. And tonight we have photographers, two photographers from the White House, Charles Ommanney of Newsweek and Brooks Kraft of Time, who have been competitors and friends since the 2000 election, and so each of them are going to show pictures, and they'll probably comment on each other's work, and we'll talk about how they do their work. And one of the aspects that we're going to look at are the public and private aspects of the presidency. And Brooks is going to show us a series of photographs that he did of pictures he took at the Bush Ranch one morning during, it was the Christmas vacation?
Yes.
And Charles is going to show us some pictures that he took on the campaign trail on the bus, following the bus last week.
Yeah,
right.
just 24 hours.
So first, let's talk about how you both got into the business, how you became photographers, what kind of background you had coming to the White House for your news organizations.
I started in newspapers when while I was in college. I went to a liberal arts college, Wesleyan University, and worked. Ended up spending a lot more time working at the Hartford Courant than I did at Wesleyan University. And I was freelancing during the evening, especially during the evenings and the weekends, and just started doing more and more of that. And worked at several newspapers coming out of college, and actually became photo editor of a small newspaper up in Massachusetts, in Holyoke, Massachusetts. But I became increasingly frustrated with just the way newspapers operate, which is basically, for a photographer anyhow, you do 2, 3, 4, 5 things a day. You're running around. You spend 5 minutes taking a picture, then you're off to do something else. And they also, newspapers tend to have a very literal approach to news. It's very, very content oriented. So the combination of just feeling kind of fragmented, and also I felt like the style of photography was, I was interested in something that was a little bit more interpretive, a little bit more creative, a little bit less literal. So after about 3 or 4 years in newspapers, I went out freelance. And photographers, a lot of freelance photographers work through agencies. There's a whole system of agencies that operate out of New York and Paris that basically act as like giant syndication services for magazines around the world. That's how a lot of magazines get their images from agencies. So I started working through agencies, and then after that developed relationships at some of the magazines, and around 96 hooked up with Time and became a contributing photographer there. And at the time I was living in Boston, and one of the main things that happens up in New England is the New Hampshire primary, so I did a lot of political coverage. And in this business you sort of it's very hard to, you get pigeonholed, as a political photographer, or as a portrait photographer, or as a war photographer. And I started out sort of by chance, just because it was sort of a national news type thing that was happening in my backyard, and I started shooting politics, and been doing it for about 10 years now.
That's very interesting. In looking at newspapers, when you were doing the newspaper photography, would you go from any kind of story? Like, would they send you out to take pictures of the mayor, and then send you out to a school, just to a variety of things, so that the only thing that was in common was that you were taking pictures?
Yeah, you go. I mean, in a way, it's really attractive. I mean, if you think about it, because you can go from shooting sports to shooting the mayor to doing a portrait to just taking a nice picture out at a lake or on the beach. But I found the reality was that I was just constantly running, And now, of course, I'm constantly running at the White House, but at least I'm constantly running in one environment. But yeah, you do sort of jump from one thing to the other. And the other thing, which was a factor for me, was in newspapers, there's kind of a ceiling. There are a few newspapers in the country that are doing just phenomenal photojournalism, and have really, really talented staffs. But there's only a handful. And at the time that I was really getting into the business, it was actually very, very hard. Newspapers were, through the 70s and the 80s, were predominantly white and male. And it was very hard to get a job if you were a white male in newspapers. I mean, it was virtually impossible for good reason. They were trying to diversify that. So there was, for me, there was also economic things pushing me away from, because at the time I didn't see any way that I could get the kind of newspaper job that I wanted. I mean, there are newspapers out there that cover their regions, the nation, and the world in a really neat and interesting way. But it didn't seem possible for me at the time.
Charles, can you tell us how you got into it?
Well, as you'll find out, I'm not nearly as serious as Brooks, but and our stories consequently are a little different. But I got into this game because the only place I could smoke at school was the dark room. And I, of course, could lock the door and tell the master that he couldn't come in because I was developing film, and we had a fan in there, so that was my start. And I consequently went on to be the director of photography at the school.
There was no combustible.
No, I had no chemicals out at all. I
didn't
even have a roll of film. I just had a packet of Marlboro Lights. But anyway, so that's how I got into it. But I woke up one day and I was 21 years old. I was just out of college. I'd done nothing to do with photography, but always had a love of it. And
where was the college?
I was at Edinburgh University in Scotland, and I'm English, as you can probably tell. I woke up one day after doing a fine art degree, which turned into a general, actually, in the second year, but that's another story. And wasn't really sure what I was going to do. I had traveled a little bit in Australia and Asia, and I knew I loved photography. And it was literally a wake-up call that I was broke and approaching 22 years old. My father was on my case, what are you going to do with your life and all that kind of stuff. And I was, what are the two things I enjoy doing syndrome was going on. And I knew I loved photography and I liked traveling. So I was literally, what two things as a job could involve those. And started working as a postman, which is a god-awful job, and involves getting up at 3:45 in the morning and being chased by all manner of dogs.
But you can smoke the whole time.
I smoked, and I wore.
You could flick the butts of the dogs.
Do you know what I did? It was so damn cold in the west of England where I was a bloody postman, that I used to wear a fur hat from Russia. And I only found out after I'd been doing this wretched job for 6 months that it was the fur bloody hat that was causing all the dogs to go after me. But anyway, cut a long story short, I saved up enough money in about 7 months and bought an old, I'll never forget it because it was the most wonderful thing I'd always dreamt about having one of these Nikon F2s, which is the camera that Dennis Hopper had in Apocalypse Now. Now, it probably means nothing to a lot of you, but it was a big deal to me. Dennis Hopper and a black F2, coolest thing since sliced bread. Anyway, so I bought this camera, and I bought it from a little camera shop in Bath in the west of England, and saved up another 3 months. And when I was growing up, I won't take too long, but when I was growing up, I used to go on holiday to a place called Corfu in Greece. Yeah. It's a little island in the Aegean off the coast of Greece, and mainland Greece. And when we used to sit on the beach, my father always used to point to this land, this very dark, kind of about 30 miles off the coast, this very dark mountainous landscape. And he used to say, you never want to go over there. That's a bad place. And this was, of course, in the 70s when Hodja was ruling Albania. And this was Albania, which was this kind of very mysterious and you know, unpleasant place well, certainly that's what people thought. And no one knew anything about it, and you know, it was off limits, and you know, if you took your fishing boat too close, or your dinghy, or whatever you were in, too close, you would you know, you would never be seen again. And so the first thing I intended to do, as soon as I had enough money, was go to Albania. This was in 1991, and actually, no, I'm sorry, it's September of 1990, and I bought myself a return ticket to Tirana, and I won't go into the whole story, but what got me into this game, really, was myself and this little Nikon F2, actually, it was bloody heavy, but anyway, we went, I went over to Albania. I didn't have a clue about photojournalism. I really didn't. I liked taking pictures, and it was as basic as that. And this was, you know, a passion of mine. And I happened to meet.
Did you have the appropriate papers to get into Albania?
Yeah, I had a you know, a visitor 2-week visitor's visa, and but nothing official. And certainly in those days, it was a real fluke that I got into Albania. I had this. It was a sham that I got in, but I met as soon as I got there, because there were so few European inverted commas journalists around, and I loved the idea of thinking that I was a journalist. I met this guy, I never forget him. He's a guy called Adrian Brown, who I years later ended up working with in Sarajevo. But I met this young guy, a stringer for the Daily Telegraph newspaper in England, and we both said, well, let's go and try and get a story published. And he was, you know, he was as new at this game really as me, a little bit more established, but he was a stringer. So he was kind of like the bottom of the rung of the freelance world. And the two of us had enough guts in those days. I think we were, you know, how you are when you're young, you're kind of fearless. We went to the Interior Ministry in Tirana, and I won't use this swear word, but we basically BS the Interior Ministry that the two of us were from Shell, and that we were geologists, and we needed to go to the north of the country, which is forbidden, a place called Bulqiza in the north of Albania, near the border with Kosovo, and we needed to go down into the chromium mines because we believed that there was oil in the chromium mines, and this could be a huge investment for the Western governments to invest in Albania as it was opening up. And they fell for it.
How did you come up with that story?
Absolutely on the fly. Didn't think about it 10 minutes before. They gave us the passes. Can you believe it? Gave us the necessary passes, and the two of us got up to this place called Bulqiza. Now, Bulqiza is where all the political prisoners were kept, and that's where they used to mine. Well, totally off limits. I mean, no journalists, and no real journalists, had ever been into this place. It was completely off limits. And lo and behold, and I'll end the story there, there's lots of adventures, nearly died and all this rest of it, but the two of us were the first Western journalists, and I say that journalists, to document the political prisoner mines in the north of Albania. And we got out of the country, and our story ran all over the Telegraph, and it was picked up everywhere, and that was the beginning. And I realized then, my God, this is a fantastic job. This is just an incredible gig.
So when you went there to the north, that's what you wanted to do, was to take the pictures of the mines?
Yes, I mean, he knew more about it because he was based in Tirana. He'd been there for about 6 weeks, and he had a little bit of a knowledge. We also, through him, got a translator who was, you know, Albanian professor who was trying to earn, you know, a couple of dollars a day working for us two layabouts. So, you know, it was a fantastic deal, and it was an extraordinary experience. I mean, it was like stepping back, to be honest with you, like stepping back to the pre-industrial revolution days, climbing thousands and thousands of feet on rotten wooden ladders down into these sulfur and chromium mines. It was extraordinary and so poisonous and so dangerous, but it was our break. And he went on to be the bureau chief in Bosnia for AFP, Agence France Presse, and I went on to, well, I want to say bigger and better things. It's debatable, But that whetted my appetite for photography, and being published is, as I'm sure I know Brooks will testify to as well, is a great feeling as a photographer, especially if it's something worth, which you put a lot of effort and blood and sweat and tears into. Went on to, this was my break, went on to cover all the wars in Eastern Europe, and I spent a lot of time in Central and Eastern Africa during the 90s, including Rwanda, 8 different trips to Rwanda, and a lot of time in Somalia and Burundi and the Southern Sudan, the war in Southern Sudan, and came to America in '97. Burnt out, really. I was a bit of a head case, and I'd seen too much and been terrified too much, and really was realizing that it wasn't for me. There's people out there, and again, Brooks will agree with me, who are very, very good at it. And he's been in some nasty situations himself, and I'd rather leave the people who are good at that to do that, because I'm more of a hindrance, in a way, to them, because it's just it's not what I want to do. And came to America in '97, and I'll wrap this up. I moved to Texas because of a girl, of course, hand in hand with the school darkroom, and started working for a Texas magazine, which is a great magazine called Texas Monthly. And this fantastic art director down there in Austin called DJ Stout, who's fabulous. He's no longer there. He's now he's now a big ad man at a company called Pentagram. But he sent me on all kinds of wonderful stories in Texas. And Texas is just like the ultimate canvas for a photographer. I mean, it's just extraordinary. The people are extraordinary. The countryside is incredible to photograph. And one of the stories that he sent me on was this story about a group of young idealists, I want to say, fresh out of college, who were working for the Child Protection Services in Texas, something called Unit 25. And now Unit 25 was horribly underfunded, but their job was to literally run into crack houses around Texas and other equally horrible places and grab babies out of these places. They didn't even have cell phones. They were so underfunded. It was the most extraordinary. They were so tired, so burnt out, and this incredible group of young kids who there was this huge turnover rate with, but there was this core of them who was just doing this. And anyway, I spent 3 weeks following these kids around in these extraordinary experiences. And it was heavy. It was a grim story, to say the least. And the magazine published the piece, and it was like an 8-page photo essay. And fantastically, the piece raised a huge amount of awareness to these kids in Texas, and raised something like $6 million for this unit through donations coming in from the people with big hair in Texas. And lo and behold, I didn't know this at the time, but of course found out afterwards, Laura Bush, the now First Lady, it was the patron of was heavily involved in this Unit 25, and kind of requested to meet me, and we kind of I was actually working on something else when I met her, and she remembered that I'd done this and stuff like this, and it was kind of an in into the world of the Bushes, and I utilized it. I haven't utilized much in my life, but I utilized this. And cut a long story short, because Brooks knows how long this story is, but I basically pitched the Bush campaign, or the Bushes initially, not even, this was way before the campaign. I pitched them that they let me document the next 2 years of their life, that I wanted to really just see into their world. And of course I'm English, and so I'm foreign, and consequently the idea of an election is still fascinating to me. I had no political interests in any way. I was just the whole circus of the American political system. It's extraordinary. And I spent the next 2 years basically working on this project, shooting all in black and white with these little German Leica cameras, and I won't even start. And he was by my side as well, and the two of us had all kinds of trials and tribulations. I mean, to say the least. But again, what happened was I kind of fell into this political scene, and when this campaign, much to my surprise, and if he's listening, he knows what I mean, he won, and suddenly, I had Newsweek magazine, who I'd worked with extensively in Europe, but covering wars and stuff, and in Africa, asking me, because I was well connected now in the White House, with this administration, would I be prepared to leave my lovely home in Austin, which I'm married, and I'm married this Texan, and would I move to Washington? And that was 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago now, and I've been living in Washington ever since, primarily covering the White House for Newsweek magazine as their kind of main man on the White House.
When you went to the Bushes, were you freelancing at that
Absolutely,
point?
yeah. I mean, I was a free merchant. In those days, I was freelancing for the Sunday Times magazine, and that's the London Sunday Times magazine, and anyone who would really give me work. I was prepared to work for Teen People. And I mean, we all were. I mean, freelancing is a tough business,
It's a very tough business.
and let's not kid ourselves. And we're very, very, very and lucky, Brooks and I, to be contract photographers. We were very lucky.
And so was the pitch that that you would distribute these pictures around a lot of different news organizations? You would hold them for the next
Initially,
couple
it was
years,
very,
or what?
very complicated, because it was actually a bit of a saga, to put it lightly. Initially, what I said to them was, if you give me the access, I'll carry a film camera I'll carry a separate camera, and you can have access to these pictures out of this camera, and you can do whatever you want with them. They're yours to document. Everything else is mine. It's my stuff. You can have the film out of this camera. I don't care what you do. And what I'd do is, to get the real access, is I would kind of go in and take a horrible picture of bless their hearts, but of Bush meeting with Mrs. Texas and shaking their hands, and I'd give them the film, but it would get me into these rooms, and I worked that for a long time with my black and white film, which was, often. Often it was, and Brooks will, vouch for this, it was often not particularly positive pictures. I mean, sometimes this film was like, it was not necessarily stuff that they would want to be seen. The rest of it, was my film to do what I wanted with. Of course, this became increasingly a problem, because I had a deal with Newsweek magazine, who had sole rights to my pictures. And of course, the crossover was kind of like, by 1999, at some period in 1999, the crossover was film camera shooting for them, my cameras. What capacity was I in that room under? And of course, it became a real problem. It became a real problem in other people's minds ethically. In my mind, because I had too many damn cameras, and in the Bush's mind, this guy is a Newsweek photographer, but he's shooting pictures for us, and why are we letting him in here to take pictures of the candidate in his underwear? So the whole thing was kind of very complicated, and eventually ended up going horribly wrong. But that's the nature of the beast.
And where did you come in on this? What kind of arrangement did you have on the campaign?
Well, I got assigned to cover Bush's first campaign trip, which was in June of '99, and that's when I met Charles, because he was already entrenched in this relationship, and I basically became Time Magazine's photographer on the campaign. So we spent the next year and a half. Covering the campaign, and I think I was there probably 80 to 90% of the time. You probably something similar. And there were many times when it was just Charles and myself, and there might be a local photographer, but we would travel on a plane with Bush, and 5 or 6 members of his senior staff. During the quiet periods in the campaign, of course, around the conventions, and on that first trip, there was 150 members of the press, so it was very different. But we they would all leave, and then it would just be a very small group of journalists.
How many reporters were there that were covering?
At what
early
stage?
on? Well, let's say in '99.
Well,
Remember, Ken Herman was talking about how few.
Right, as I said,
people there were.
in the beginning, like on that first trip, and in the beginning, there was a huge amount of interest, because there was all this buzz about Bush right from the start. But then it kind of tailed off, and I can
What's
remember
happening with Kerry now?
Yeah, exactly. The political cycle has these big events, conventions. Among them, and of course it's always when you go from Labor Day to Election Day, there's 100+ members of the press following the candidates through. But right now in the Kerry campaign, there's you've been out there. What is there? Probably 10 people.
Very few now.
Yeah, if that. Yeah.
During the primary, all the primaries up in New Hampshire and Iowa,
Yeah.
you couldn't move for press.
Right.
I mean, it was everything the candidate would want. I mean, he had, saturation coverage of everything he said.
Yeah.
And in Kerry's case, it worked. He came out of the gloom and doom of being in the shadows, obviously, only 3 weeks before he won Iowa. Now, it's a different ball game, and it will be, Kerry's people would love to have, us lot around right now, and periodically we go in, do a little bit, and come out again. But it's going to be kind of a tough time between now and the end of July, which is obviously the Democratic conventions, and it's kind of like they're trying very hard, as you know, Martha, to try and keep a message out there, which is obviously made increasingly difficult by what's going on in Iraq.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, in the last campaign cycle, we stuck straight through. I mean, we were there pretty much.
The whole time.
We would take. I would take a week off here or there, but we were there pretty much straight through it. So during this time, when there's only a few people around, and that's when you get to know the candidate, you develop relationships with the communications people, and also when you see things, that most people don't see. And because it's a smaller operation, it's a whole different ballgame.
And of course, you get to know the candidate in such a close way that once he comes into the White House, you have a good sense of who he is, and then also how he changes.
And with
over
these
time.
guys, I can't speak for prior presidents because I just simply didn't cover them. But with these guys, it's all about relationships with these people. I was very surprised. Brooks and I, gain a little bit of access now and then because of those days of spending, sitting with Karen Hughes and Carl Rove in a small plane, and that's it. And our magazine's kind of invested, I suppose, in that, and that's how it's happened.
Let's look at some of your photographs, and you each have pictures of sort of the public and the private.
Well, I'm going to just firstly say that that this 40 picture set is just an example for you guys of. Oh, someone's leaving.
She's going to get a smoke.
God, you're going to miss out. This 40 picture set is not definitive by any means. It's a one and a half day bus trip that I went on last week, which kind of signals in a way. I mean, there's been fundraising galore in the Bush world, which is obviously very it's campaign related. But really, this bus trip that we did last week is the first time in this election cycle, I think, that here we go again. Bush Cheney 04 everywhere, screaming people, bus, waving out the bus, blah blah blah. And so this was, as a magazine, of course we didn't run any of it, but that's another story altogether because Rumsfeld became such a big story.
Yeah, right.
But we went out and we spent a day and a half with Bush, And what I'm going to show you is just the take that I sent the magazine. This is what I transmitted to the magazine on Tuesday, basically giving them an option to use one of these pictures if the story would hold. Very unusual, I might add, for a story to hold Tuesday through the end of the week. So I was kind of slightly aware that, you know, this was really for long term. You know, this was probably something that we might come back to at the end of the year.
And that's what in magazines, you know, we're not as fixed. When you pick up a newspaper, in general, you see pictures, you know, contextual pictures from events that happened yesterday. But magazines, you know, even if we knew that it was unlikely, let's say the Rumsfeld story had already developed and this bus trip came up and we knew it was unlikely the pictures are going to be used next week, we would still go out because it's part of developing a library of photos, and you basically just have to go out there and cover everything because you don't know exactly what you're going to need and when you're going to need it. And our magazines make last-minute decisions, and suddenly they're looking for a picture of Bush as a campaigner, or they're looking for a picture of Bush with his wife, or they're looking for a picture of Bush with one of his advisors. And the only way you get it is to cover everything.
How do you archive the pictures? Do you you have them on your own laptops, but when they go into the magazine, how does the magazine keep them?
Very secret formula. They have a better way than us.
They're just, you know, we just have massive image servers in New York, and they have software to browse the photos, and they can the editors can sit at their desk and type in, you know, Bush campaign 2004, and then push a button, and then all the pictures come up. You know, it's, there's huge search engines. I keep everything as well on my end, archiving on DVDs and external hard drives. And one of the nice things about digital is when we covered the first campaign, it was all film, and it was always, I mean, it's unbelievable. You know, the stuff just gets, because we each have, you know, 10 editors, and they're each working on 2 different stories, you know, and everyone's chasing down that little slide or negative or print, and stuff just gets lost and misplaced, and it's hard to find. And now, actually, with digital, it's a lot easier because, and in some ways potentially more dangerous too, but we can talk about that at another time. But because the pictures can be, I can have an original, my editors can have an original, you know, I can have an original here in New York, and it all can move around very quickly instead of just, you know, it all being tied to the physical presence of a slide or a negative.
And do you, when you're archiving them, do you put down, like for a particular picture, this is, you know, President and Mrs. Bush, and several things about it, so you can then pull it up just by going through and doing a search, a word search?
Yeah, that's very important, is writing, this has been an experience I know for me, is writing good captions, because that's the way pictures are searched. So, you know, in the picture like the one up on the screen there, you know, it's got to say Laura Bush in there, or anything else that's pertinent to it. So when an editor's searching, you know, the right pictures come up.
Yeah. Okay.
That's
Charles, do you
one
want
of my better ones. One picture and I dropped the whole system. Another thing, you know, talking about this digital stuff is, you know, let's not forget that we, you know, I lost a horrible amount of film during that 2 years campaign because, you know, too many cooks in the kitchen, too many people handling
Where would
the
they
stuff.
get lost?
Who knows? I mean, you know, I could have, you know, the kick-ass image sitting on the coffee room floor in New York, for all I know, under the fridge. So, are we going through this? Can I talk a little bit about that? Okay, so we're going to go through this pretty quickly. But
Let's go back to the first one. Can we go back to it? Or?
yeah.
And where was it?
You know, we basically, you know, Brooks and I were also, as much as we work for the magazine, we're also represented by 2 very good agencies. Myself, Contact Press in New York and Paris, and Brooks's case Corbis, which is pretty much everywhere. And so when we see people like the First Lady, and this might sound a little bit naff, it's actually important for stock to photograph, if you can, reasonably nice pictures of these 2 together, because you don't get to see them together that much. and it's very good stock for the agency, because that is your kind of, I don't know if this is, but it's kind of your future, it's your pension in a way as a photographer, you know, all this. So, for instance, you know, this is a bit of a happy, smiley picture, but it's good stock. And it's something that, you know, people can come to in Paris if they're doing something about the First Lady's fashion. And so we shoot these quite generic images sometimes, which, you know, we don't look at as art. Let's not kid ourselves. But they're good. They're a good thing to do. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
And for an editorial photographer, because you know, we don't make that much money from our magazines, having the secondary source of income for your pictures is very important. And these our pictures are published subsequently, you know, in magazines around the world, if we do a good job.
right.
How do you determine which ones go to your magazines and which ones go elsewhere?
I send the whole take to the magazine, and I'll send the same take to my agency. If you go on, let's move along. This is an image that, of course, I like, but will never see the light of day. And this is very typical of us and our business. We shoot pictures like this because we kind of like kind of the imagery in it.
Yeah.
But it's never going to be used, but certainly not by maybe our magazines.
Right.
Let's keep going. Standard
Where
bush.
are these taken? Where was the?
These are all in Ohio and Michigan, and these first ones are in Michigan, in Detroit, and you know, for all you know, Bush is a good man, and Brooks will agree with me. He's a good man. You know, we try and make the most out of these situations. These situations are diabolical for photography. This guy is standing at a podium, surrounded by a bunch of screaming Republicans, and they're invariably not that well lit. Or reasonably lit, better than Kerry's people, and you know, it's hard to make pictures of these things. You know, sometimes it's fabulous to see some of the kind of artists of the world come and try and do this, but because they come in and they're like, I don't know how you do this. This is a nightmare. And it's really difficult to make pictures of someone standing with a microphone. Take my word for it. You know, but Bush, anyway, as I was going to say, Bush is quite. As far as this goes, he's quite good to photograph because he's very expressive, and his face is just, you know, he has so many different expressions, doesn't he? He you know, he's like this, you know, he's all over the place with his face, and you can watch him in his body too. I mean, you know, let's keep going. Just standard fare, walking around. These pictures usually come from being bored and having heard the speech 1,000 times. And so you go wandering off into the audience, and again, this is kind of stock. Just in case a big story came out that week, standard procedure is to take a headshot. Just in case, you know, big story comes out about Bush, so you'll always just take a few headshots. Brooks is the king of it. Let's keep going. More of the same. There's just 3 examples of his body language.
Yeah, that's.
Flick on through.
Very. Yeah.
These images are slightly off because they're compressed to fit on the screen, but these kind of, what this body language and the way he expresses himself happen in over a period of seconds. He's like this, like this.
That's nice.
And that's and there's all are images of when he's happy, you know, when he's content, when he's comfortable. He does those kinds of things. When he's uncomfortable, he has other kinds of...
But Bush is surprisingly good on the podium like this, when he's got 5,000 people around him shouting and screaming. He never used to be, as we'll both tell you about. But it's when you put him in front of a TV camera that he seems to kind of like just, you know, how we see these...
Like a wrestler?
When he talks to the nation. When he speaks to the nation.
I mean, he's in front of TV cameras here, but what you're saying is when he's got a big speech to give.
When he's got a big speech, he's kind of quite expressive. When you see him in front of, when he speaks to the nation at 8 o'clock during The Sopranos, he sits there and he bless his heart, you know, he's had someone do a lot of makeup. I'm going to get shot when I walk outside, but you know, someone do a lot of makeup, and you know, he's very kind of like deer in the headlights.
That's when he's
And he's
sitting.
not. That's not at his best. That's
Yeah.
not what's
Yeah.
best for him. You know, it's
Yeah.
extraordinary. Anyway, so this again, this is just another angle. You know,
Yeah, that's a nice
and the whole key to our game, and when Brooks comes on, he'll testify to it too. Magazine photographers, their job is to try and get something different to what is on the wires from each event. So we'll never really publish a picture that is very similar to a picture that has been that past week
Right.
in all the newspapers. And so we're kind of a nuisance because we're always moving around, but we're trying to always photograph things
Yeah.
in the most mundane situations, but in a different way.
And that's a
That's
good
very
example.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
That's very difficult to do, though, isn't it?
Oh, it's very hard.
Very difficult. I mean, it is, and it's so funny because the other photographers, the newspaper photographers and the wild photographers, all think we're slightly batty, but we are actually trying to do something.
But sometimes it's as simple as just an expression or a moment. You know, it doesn't have to be a dramatic angle, although it can be.
I remember one day in the Oval Office, you were shooting the picture of not just the president, but you were shooting a picture that had it had I think, Andy Card and it had Condi Rice, Colin Powell, and Rumsfeld, I think, in it.
Right.
And so that you were interested in not just what the president was doing, you were trying to shoot that shot. And I remember also one day when both of you were shooting different pictures within the Oval Office, and I think there was people were unhappy that you were trying to take pictures of the desk and all sorts of things.
Barney.
Right.
Standard campaign fare, but you know,
Yeah.
again, you know,
Great.
it's the kind of beginning of the season. You can't really see this picture, but Blake, his kind of aid,
Oh,
is
yeah,
kind
that's
of
right.
funny the way he's opening the door for him, but you can't really tell in the picture on the TV screen. Let's keep going.
Was he
on
just
too
trying
long.
not to be in the picture?
He's just trying to not be in the picture. Of course, that to us guys means he has
Yes,
to be in the
great
picture.
picture.
Just Bush's eyes, flags, again,
Uh-huh.
standard fare. Just
Yeah.
keep going.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I missed that one. That's it. That's it.
Uh-huh.
We look for this a lot. Like, that's really nice, unusual light.
And those are actually people standing up there, on
Yeah.
the hilltop.
Yeah. Where was it?
It's all a bit
So-
of a
some-
blur.
Detroit.
somewhere in the
Must have been
heartland.
Detroit.
Yeah, because
Detroit,
there was one.
yeah.
Okay, let's keep going. That's just a wider version of
wow.
the same picture.
Yeah.
Let's keep going. This is all in Detroit. Bush coming out. He's about to trip up, but he didn't. Bunch of very excited ladies in red. And then this is always I find this extraordinary. When I was growing up and I was 17 years old, the last thing on my mind was going to a political rally.
That's
I
because you were
still-
trying to find a place to smoke.
I was also doing other things, but this blows my mind that
Uh-huh.
these people are at the front of the stage, and they must have been there for hours. They've been magged, checked, double checked, 3 times checked, and these young girls and boys, are screaming and shouting. I mean, that to me is just.
Do you find
extraordinary.
that in the other campaigns? Do you find that when the Kerry campaign, for example?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
in some ways more so.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Let's keep going. Then you got this lot.
Mm-hmm.
This is a much more of a typical Republican bunch. They're even in the trees. And this it continues to blow my mind. How this guy was standing in the audience and saying Amen, Amen, and stuff after Bush was speaking. I was just standing there going, my God. And he's touching the faith of, I think it's his cover, the faith of pancake breakfast. I mean, what can I say? just, have to, we live in hope that we're going to get a double truck in the magazine. A double truck is a double page, and you shoot these kind of pictures because you have this kind of fantasy that you can lay text in the left-hand side of the image, and there's good amount of space for the page break. So we often shoot this way, thinking, design-wise.
Very true.
Does it work?
Not always. Air Force One.
Did you have trouble getting that particular angle? Because they usually try to herd you in a particular area.
Yeah, the key to shooting from back there is to be the last person out of the van. And then what you do is, when everyone else is kind of getting onto the plane, you're kind of running across the tarmac, pretending to get on the plane. And what you can do is, but what happens is, because, you know what I mean, he's then kind of coming up the steps, and you can kind of quickly grab your camera and shoot 3 or 4 frames before, anyone sees, and then you pretend to be getting on, then you get on the plane. But, it's you're not meant to really photograph from back there. But, I mean, I have to say, I'm scraping the barrel a bit with these images, because, we go on these trips, and often there's not an awful lot to photograph, and so, we take these pictures because that's what we can get out of it. Some days you'll go and we'll come away and we'll go, that was awesome. That was really good for pictures. Some days we'll come back and we'll go, nothing. So this was a bit of a scrape the barrel job, but let's keep on going. Bush coming out. I don't know if you guys can see in Baltimore, but you can see his speech in this picture. And a whole lot of the stuff is underlined, and I was
going to say, is that
writing? Yeah, it's writing, and it's reminding him of the names that he's, people he's talking about. Okay, let's keep going. Again, looking for the double page. Again, looking for the double page.
Text left.
Yeah.
Text left.
Okay, here we go. Bush Cheney 04.
Who drives the bus?
The Secret Service agent. Let's keep going.
Can people see much on the outside? Can they see him?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. But not only out the front window. The rest of it is
Right.
probably, 4-inch steel. Notice that the Secret Service agent actually is a cardboard cutout.
Were you able to get into the bus?
No. Of course I wanted to.
You didn't figure a way? But it's
No.
early in the campaign.
No, I'll get onto the wretched thing one day. Did you get on the bus?
No.
Secret Service agent again. We often use them to frame our pictures. They can become quite useful.
They're everywhere also.
No, they're everywhere. Let's keep on going. I mean, 6 months before the election, and these auditoriums are filled.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I can't reiterate it enough. I'm completely apolitical. I'm neither a Republican or Democrat. I make fun of both of them.
A contrarian.
But I really do. But I mean, this kind of thing is pretty. There's a lot of people out there supporting this guy. And I mean, again, I'll get shot when I walk out the door. But I haven't been seeing these kind of crowds with his opposition.
And in 2000, did you see the same kinds of crowds, or what were the crowds like?
Yeah, bigger and bigger. They get bigger and bigger. Again, trying to make something out of the podium. There's a big podium there, and you'll find us two and a couple of the other photographers lying down in the buffer zone, as it's called, trying to contorting ourselves, trying to get the podium out of the picture. And this is invariably how this is.
Do you use remote cameras on the campaign trail? Or is
I
that
don't.
only at the White House?
I don't. And you probably don't on the campaign trail, do you?
Sometimes I do. Yeah, sometimes we set up, I think I may have some examples of it to show, but we set up cameras on like little mini tripods or clamp them onto things and then fire them remotely, simply because we want to get an angle from somewhere and we can't be there. We're not, we can't stand there, so we do use remote cameras.
Okay, let's finish up. I think it's just another variation. on that. And that's my lot. That's from about a 24-hour period on the road last week.
Okay.
And that's the take I sent to the magazine, in case they wanted to do something on that. I mean, the obvious picture would be from that set would probably be the waving from the bus picture. But you know, that's kind of that's a very typical set of pictures that would be sent to the magazine from a day on the road. And we do a lot of this. I mean, you know, we go on the road a lot. The key to it is to be pull, which means you get to fly on Air Force One and you get home 4 hours early.
Okay, Brooks, can you show us your pictures? Can you tell us about the opportunity that you had, and including how did you get the opportunity
Well,
to
first,
film?
why don't I show some of the pictures first, so people know what we're talking about, and then we can talk about it. Are you ready?
Yes.
All right. Do I need to start it, or? Occasionally, probably once or twice a year, Charles and I both get an opportunity to shoot something that's not public, that's not open to the press corps, that's it's been coined sort of behind the scenes. It's exclusive access, and these kinds of opportunities can come up in a variety of different ways. But for me, I basically try to come up with an idea, and first talk to my editors about it, and then pitch it to if they sign off on it, then pitch it to the White House. And this first one is from is sort of the day of his State of the Union speech, not this last one in 2004, but 2003. So it's spending just a day with him at the White House and then traveling with him to give his State of the Union speech, which was a big deal at the time, and I can't even remember why now.
Well, in retrospect, that's the one that
Actually,
had the 16 words.
Yes, yeah, that was it. Okay, so this is the morning before the State of the Union speech, talking in the cabinet room with Christy Todd Whitman.
And you were there by
wait.
yourself as far as the photography?
Yeah, well, these aren't coming up in order, but we'll, in any case, this is, it's a little hard to see here, too, on the TV screen. Yeah, in this, I'm by myself, except there are White House photographers that are pretty much always around, but there's no other press around. So it's standard to have the White House photographers document just about everything that the president does. He's working on the final draft of his speech with an assistant in the Oval Office.
Who was the assistant? Was it
Harriet
Myers?
No, she was the person in charge of paper.
Harriet Myers.
Oh, yeah,
Staff secretary.
Yeah, staff secretary.
She's now
Yeah.
Deputy Chief of Staff
Right.
for policy.
This is Rumsfeld and Powell, and sometimes little things will come out of these stories. Like this is a picture we ended up using extensively through the war. This because Rumsfeld and Powell, of course, were on opposite opposite ends of the political spectrum, and they're talking just before a cabinet meeting. Now, fortunately, these are out of order. I guess the filing, but this is just before he goes up and gives a State of the Union speech, talking with Daschle and other House leadership in a room right off the floor.
How long would he be in that room?
Like 5 minutes. And then this is from the floor while he's giving the speech, receiving a standing ovation from the Republicans on the right, while the Democrats on the left sit.
Yeah, it's nice.
Now we're going back this is a picture that was taken during a cabinet meeting where he basically filled his cabinet meeting in on what he was going to say in the State of the Union speech. And the Bush cabinet starts every meeting with a prayer. And this is a picture that we used a lot, that got played extensively.
Great.
Because it had you know, it's got Powell, Rumsfeld, everybody in it, and it sort of captured a little bit of the tension of the time. Next. This is right before he goes out to give the speech. He clears everybody out of the room and spends a couple minutes collecting his thoughts. So I'm in there just for a second to take, literally 15 seconds, get a picture, and then leave him alone.
And there's nobody else in there?
No, there's a White House photographer in there and maybe one other photographer from the Senate or something. But there's no, this isn't a picture that was published anywhere until it ran in time.
Would the other photographers, do you all just have a tacit understanding, you just stay out of each other's way so that when they can see when you're lining up for a picture, they will make sure to be out of the way?
In this situation, no, it's, I don't know if there's a tacit understanding, but, it's, sometimes, you ask if there is another photographer in the room. And again, in this case, it's just one, as I remember. So it's not that hard. But, we talk, but there are no ground rules per se. This is as he comes out on the floor. And this is after the speech with his sister and Laura Bush and a niece or something, I can't remember who. I think that's it for that one. All right, let me show you one other group. Let's do. Let me get this one right.
Control A.
Okay, so then try.
Brooks, Control A. You have to select them all.
Okay, this is a series of pictures that was taken out on the ranch. Bush spends a tremendous amount of time on his Texas ranch. He's been there like 200 or 300 days. He spent 200 or 300. These pictures were taken on December 29th, 2003. And at that point, there's a guy, Mark Knoller, who works for CBS Radio, and he keeps stats of everything. And he told me that he had spent 257 days as president on the ranch, and so, which to me is extraordinary. And yet we see very little of what he does out there. So the idea was to just go spend some time with him and see a little bit of what he does, what his typical days like. And it took me about 6 or 7 months to set this up. I tried over and over again, and for one reason or another, he wanted a vacation. He didn't want anybody around. It wasn't the right time, and so it's a process of continually requesting and talking to the press secretary about it, and finally I got an opportunity to do it in December. So this is driving to every morning. He has an intelligence briefing, even when he's on the ranch. And this is driving with his dog to the briefing at about 7:30 in the morning. And this is inside a trailer, a secure trailer on the ranch, where he has a hookup. I don't know if you can tell here. You could see it in the magazine, but that's Dick Cheney on the screen on the left there, and Condi Rice, and somebody from the CIA, and he gets his morning intelligence briefing. And this is, at least the day that I was there, this was sort of the work portion of the day. He spends an hour or two in the trailer. And on a picture like that, I'm in the room for 30 seconds. I'm not sitting there listening to the whole briefing. These are glimpses. Then his favorite pastime is to cut cedar brush on his ranch, and he goes out with a chainsaw and clears land. He explained, I guess in Texas, the undergrowth prevents all this shrubbery, sucks up all the water, and if you don't cut it away, you don't get big, large trees on the ranch. So there's an environmental element to it. But for him, I think it's just a way to release a lot of energy.
Mm-hmm.
He's with a group of people shouting, hey, let's clear this over here, let's burn this, let's, he really, really enjoys it.
Who are the people that are there that are helping?
Staff people, deputy chief of staff.
Anybody who couldn't figure out how to get out of it?
Right. A few ranch hands. So it's sort of a mixture of people that, locals, people that work for him.
Mm-hmm.
And then he burns. He makes these big piles of the brush that they cut and burns it.
Mm-hmm.
He spent about 2 hours doing this,
Mm-hmm.
which he does just about every day he's out there. That's the guy he bought the ranch land from.
How many acres is it?
I want to say it's 1,600 acres.
Yeah, you're right.
Yep.
It's about 60.
That's the house. I wanted to show something where you could see a little bit of the house. It's actually quite small.
Yeah, it looks like. How many square feet do you think?
I don't know, maybe 2,000, or 2,000, 3,000. I mean, it's not 10,000 plus.
So it doesn't dominate the landscape.
No,
in
not
any
at
way.
all. No. In fact, if you're any distance from it, it's very hard to see.
Yeah, it's not.
He fishes every day
Uh-huh.
with his dog.
And what kind of fish are in there?
Wide-mouth bass, stocked, of course.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
This picture was actually taken in the morning when he was walking to his
Nice picture.
to his truck.
Yeah.
And so that's it. That's just, and again, it's, I look at this as a glimpse, as a way to sort of take a peek inside something. I mean, he knows I'm there. It's not meant to be sort of a definitive story, but the idea is to see a little bit of something, to show a little bit of something to our readers that doesn't normally get seen. But these things are really, really hard to set up and to organize, and there's a tremendous amount of competition to get them, as you can imagine. And we're not just talking about Time and Newsweek. We're talking about newspapers, networks, the hundreds of different organizations that cover the White House.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they seem to like television and a great deal.
Right.
And what was the winning argument that you presented on this of why they should do it?
The winning argument that I presented, and it's actually one of the main reasons I wanted to do it, was this is a place Bush loves more than anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
This is the place he loves to be, and he's spending a lot of time there, and nobody really nobody's seen very much of it. I mean, he has a press conference out there, with the prime minister or a president or a foreign leader, but that's two podiums,
Right.
and you don't see anything more than a hay bale in the background.
Mm-hmm.
I think they understood what I was trying to do, and it was a question of then figuring out a good time to do it.
Did you hear from them afterwards?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they liked it.
Mm-hmm. How do you hear?
It's interesting because the picture from the sequence that provided the most that I heard the most about was him holding the chainsaw.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about it was that that people that really did not like Bush thought it was a terrific photo because he looked like a lunatic with a chainsaw. And people that did like Bush, from the White House, thought it was really cool because he looked macho and he was.
Yeah.
And in my mind, that's actually the mark of a good picture, because we live in such a polarized world now with Bush. I mean, it's unbelievable. People. We ran a cover about a year ago, love him or hate him, and how America is polarized, and it's really true. I mean, I don't know. I hear it and see it everywhere we go.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can take a picture that that sort of both sides of this chasm that we live in respond to, then that's
Have you found, both of you, since you started taking pictures of Bush, that his sense of the camera has changed? That he has become more comfortable with the camera, more interested in what comes out of the camera?
I had, and I think Charles too, had a lot of trouble with him early on because he didn't really understand photojournalism. He thought when you took a picture, taking a picture meant looking at the camera and smiling. So, we would be in these situations and he would see us, stop and smile at the camera, which of course is not what we want. And I think slowly he's begun to understand that, although a lot of times that's still a challenge, especially if you're the only person in the room. If you're the only person there.
I mean, I want to say that he's got a little better, but I'm not sure he has. I mean, the thing. It's not I don't mean that in a nasty way in any way. I think he's easily distracted, and I think that we're a distraction to him. And I mean, my dream is, and to a certain degree, I'm sure Brooks is the same, is to go into a meeting in the Oval Office or wherever, and just be forgotten about, and just to be a fly on the wall, not to have someone turn to you and go, "What do you want me to do?" It's like that's the worst case scenario,
right.
And when someone says that, and you say, "Just do what you're doing, sir," that means that you immediately got to register that you're there, and that means that the photo is going to be crap.
It's very true.
I sometimes look at Clinton. I mean, I don't know what Clinton was like because, of course, I didn't cover him. But I look at some of the photographers like Diana Walker and people who were photographing Clinton, and they look like genuine moments. I mean, they look like this guy would go about his business, just like a colleague, a good friend of mine, a guy called Nick Danzinger, who's been doing a story on Blair in England. Blair is completely, will go about his business as if he's not there, and Nick will just photograph this guy, and consequently gets amazing photographs of real moments. And I find that quite tough at the White House.
It's very hard with Bush, and he has to really be involved. I think I can count on one hand the number of times I've photographed him where I really felt like he sort of forgot that I was in the room. And I think on election night, Charles and I were with him on election night in 2000, while there was all these twists and turns in what was coming in. And I felt like that night, he really forgot we were there. And then a couple of times in post 9/11 in meetings and things, there's been glimpses of it. But in general, he's very aware, and as a result, it is very difficult to capture candid moments.
Let's take some questions. Towson?
Having known the Bushes so long, what are their personal feelings toward both of you, and what are both of your personal feelings toward the Bushes?
Personal?
Yeah.
Personally, when Bush is not in front of a TV camera, he is very, very engaging, very funny, and just an enjoyable person to be around. I find he has a very different personality, and it's actually striking to me sometimes. During the campaign, we were walking in and out of that world a lot more than I am now. But it's really hard to understand how different he is when there's not a lot of press around. And I got the sense in talking to Diana Walker, who did this kind of thing with Clinton, the Clinton, I think Clinton was more of sort of one personality. He didn't have this public persona, this private persona. What do you,
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and he was extremely kind. He's been extremely kind to me at times, and on a personal level, again, I think he's actually a nice chap. And Brooks and I sat and analysed the hell out of this because of talking about our photography and trying to work out, when's the best time to try and photograph this guy. We've spent years looking at his every move. Can you imagine doing that? And you become very good at judging. At very perceptive of being able to tell what kind of mood someone's in. So we're quite kind of clued into this guy. But on a personal level, him and the First Lady, I mean, she's a lovely, lovely woman, and as a kind, sweethearted, sweet-natured woman who is the furthest you could think from being a political figure. I mean, she's very nice, and as I say, Bush has at times been extremely sweet to me, and quite a different personality to the person that you and I see, on a public level.
I think one thing that I picked up on immediately was he does not enjoy formality in these big sort of formal, elaborate White House type things. I can remember when we went to Normandy. He's going again next month, but we went to Normandy. I had this image in my mind as a child of this great photograph of Reagan walking through the graveyard in Normandy with all the crosses. It was one of those images that that I remember seeing, and it's always kind of been embedded in my mind. And when I heard that Bush was going to go do this thing, I was like, oh, this is great. I finally have a chance to make this kind of picture in this historic site. When we got there, and Bush practically ran through the graveyard. I mean, it was unbelievable. And, he just didn't, and it was this big thing, the lights, the cameras, and everything. He doesn't, whereas Clinton, that Clinton and Reagan would respond much differently to that. And part of why I wanted to go to the ranch was because I know he loves it there, and you see an entirely different kind of person.
What do you see has taken place as far as his aging, the impact of the office on him? Do you see it from the campaign in 2000? Do you see that he looks different than he did then?
I think he's aged. Visually, I think he's aged. I think his face has aged, and I think his actual demeanor, his whole demeanor has aged. But on a character level, I don't see. I mean, I don't get to see enough of him behind the scenes to really be able to say, really. But I don't think. I think he's still kind of similar. I mean, he's got to have changed. Let's face it. I mean, the last 4 years would have changed anyone. But
yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. A question from here? Anybody have a question?
Earlier, you mentioned the importance of relationships with this administration. Like, do you feel that you censor a lot of your work so that you can keep relationships with them?
That's
a good
question.
relationship?
very good.
No, you can't. I mean, you can't censor your work. We've both put pictures out there, that they aren't happy with, and you can't do it. Where it becomes very difficult, though, is in the exclusive behind the scenes situations. It's one thing from a public event, but when you're the only person in the room, I'm very careful. I'm involved in the editing and the selection of pictures by the magazine, and I'm very careful to not pick pictures that I think are unfair. Now, that doesn't mean that, like, for example, the picture of him with the chainsaw. A lot of people could look at that picture and say he looks like a madman. To me, I looked at it and said, okay, well, that really captures, that's what it looked like when we were out there. And you can look at it either way. But if there was a picture if that really wasn't what it looked like out there, I would be very careful about sending photographs in that that aren't accurate representations. So from a public event, no. I mean, if I have more pictures here, we're not going to have time to look at today. Of him crying, of him looking pissed off, of him scowling, and we send those pictures in all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's tough. I totally agree with. Very good question though.
Yeah.
I totally agree with Brooks. Public event, it's kind of open game.
Yeah.
But when you're, behind the scenes, it's a tough one. And I won't go into it now, but I had a very good example last year. One of the dangerous things with us now shooting digital, funnily enough, is that quite often we'll take a picture and then we'll go and work on we'll download the images from our cameras onto our computers and work on the pictures, getting ready to send them to the magazine. Now what that means is invariably we're in places where other people can see us working on our computers. You can become so involved in working on those pictures that you forget that in fact someone could walk behind you and look over your shoulder and see the picture you're working on and go, oh my God. Well, a case happened like that for me about a year ago where I was behind the scenes and I got an opportunity to photograph the president in a way, that was unique and was different. And I was invited by the president to go and photograph this particular situation. Now I couldn't turn around to the president and say, I'm sorry, sir, I can't come and photograph you doing that because I'm not authorized to do that. You're being invited by the President of the United States. And anyway, cut a long story short, and I won't go, as I say, I won't go into it now, but it was very tough because I went back after that and started working on this set of pictures that I'd just shot, and one of the people from the press office walked behind me and saw this picture that I was working on and decided this was not what they wanted to be going out in a major news magazine. And it caused a nightmare where I had to spend the weekend, about 2 or 3 days over a Friday through Thursday through Saturday, fighting for this image to be allowed to be used. Really, it was my magazine obviously wanted to use it. The White House, they were like, this wasn't authorized. You weren't meant to be there. This wasn't meant. This is not part of our controlled message, essentially. And it was a very difficult situation. And this came from sitting on my computer working on the image.
You probably would have heard from them, though, anyway, when it went out, right?
Oh yes, I mean, I most definitely.
So it's just a question of when you're going to hear from.
It's a very good question and a very difficult situation. But it really is. I mean, as Brooks says, public domain, it's open. It's open.
Right.
We're open game. But we get back into these situations, and it's tough. And let's not forget, it's not Bush that we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
Bush is like, do your bloody thing.
Yeah.
And get on with it. It's all the people
It's the
around
communications
him.
people.
It's the
Yeah.
communications people all around him who really, it's their job to essentially control the image.
They control the image, and they get nervous, especially if it's
Very.
something exclusive and that hasn't been talked about in their staff meetings. When these events, they're planned to the tiniest
Finest
little
detail.
finest detail, and they know exactly what's going to come out of them. So these sorts of things are wild cards for them, and they don't want to stick their neck out, and be the one that let somebody take a picture of.
Yeah, the staff are very risk averse. And
Yes,
it doesn't
very
make
risk averse.
It make any difference what administration. And one of the things that, interestingly, they have managed to control over the years are photographs of the president. And so the kind of access that you get in those circumstances really represents something that's a real change.
Right, and the whole thing we're trying to do is show something that really hasn't been seen. So
Yeah.
that's,
Right.
to them, that's a.
So when you send in pictures to your own news organization, are you think carefully about which ones you send? Because you're not sending everything, you're sending a sample,
I
right?
don't think I think carefully about it. I send the pictures I like.
Right.
It's as simple as that. I mean, you know,
pictures
obviously,
of-
if there's a story you know that the magazine is working on, you'll send them a selection of pictures, maybe which will tie in with what they're working on editorially. But I generally just send them pictures that I personally like.
And we're desperate to capture any kind of emotion or nuance of personality. So if we have a photograph, you know, where he looks angry, or if he looks frustrated, or if he looks euphoric, you know, we're always looking for that. Because those moments are hard to find, you know, in the White House world, which is very controlled and on message.
When you're taking pictures and you're in an exclusive environment and you hear things, are you very careful not to talk about anything that you've heard? Or do you just not hear because you're focusing on what you're doing?
You know what? It's funny. I've been asked that so many times, and you know what? As a photographer, I can speak for myself. Is I'm never listening to what they're talking about. You know, you go into a room. I don't think I've ever come out of one of these rooms and gone, my God, I must tell so and so about that. That's extraordinary. I've never, you know.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, there's also a little bit of when we're going behind the scenes, like the stuff we do, there's an unwritten rule there that is, you know, is part of the trust. You know,
Right.
you're not going in there and coming out and telling your reporter,
Right.
you know, what you just heard.
Yeah,
That's
and
for
no,
sure.
that's very important. And that's simply because we're photographers.
Yeah.
You know, we're not reporters, and that is definitely an unwritten rule, and it's true. I
Yeah.
agree. You know, that when you're thinking visually, you know, when you're looking at light, when you're looking at hand gestures, when you're looking at the combinations of people and trying to figure out how you can compose and make a picture, you know, you can, if somebody shouts or if there's like a loud or something that sort of sticks out, then you might hear it. But if it's just a general hum of conversation, no,
Having said that, I do remember a time that I went into the Oval Office. I do remember a time I went into the Oval Office to photograph him and Tenet meeting, the Tenet, the head of the CIA. And I remember walking in, and Bush turned to me and said, "Oh, we know everything about you." And Tenet looked at me and said, "Everything." and I remember photographing these two guys standing by a window, just out of earshot, but thinking, I wonder what they're talking about.
Towson?
I had a question for Brooks. Earlier you spoke about you didn't really like the conservative pictures that you had to take for newspapers. And I wanted to see if you could distinguish between a conservative photo and a liberal photo.
If I said conservative, I used the wrong word. What I was trying to, newspapers are, in general, the style of photography in newspapers is much more literal. If I said conservative, I think what I meant to say was literal. You know, it's the president at the event, who was there, who was standing next to him, what's the background. Magazines, we come out weekly, and we're sort of, you know, looking at what's in the president's mind, what is he thinking, what is he feeling, what was the process by which the White House came to decide its policy on Iraq. So the pictures are a little bit more about nuance and personality, and a little bit less about the fact that the president went to a military base and he was standing, you know, with Rumsfeld and Powell in front of a tank. So it's a different style of photography, and it's not. It has nothing to do with political ideology, conservative versus liberal.
A question from here? Okay, yeah.
You talk about things being controlled. It seems to me we never see any sign of dissension anywhere near the president. And for those of us who grew up in earlier political eras where the president was always surrounded by signs and things that were in opposition to his politics, is this all really controlled? Is there a free speech zone that...
It's an interesting story about that. just this week on the bus tour, we wanted some photographs of protesters, and my editor called me up and said, can you take photographs of protesters? And I said, well, no, you're going to have to send someone else to do that, because logistically, the way that it works is we come in motorcades and buses, and we're going on the bus tour last week, 3, 4, 5 stops a day, and we come in, and there's all kinds of security issues. We have to be swept and made sure that we're not carrying anything dangerous, and it's not possible for us to sometimes move freely, like out around the events. So the protest, there's always a protest area, but sometimes it can be 2 or 3 blocks from the site or across the street from the site, and it can be very difficult. There have been times when we've been able to do it, but it can be very difficult for us to to sort of get out of what they call the bubble, and everybody that comes into that bubble has to be swept and made sure that they're secure. So it's difficult.
I think maybe what you were asking. So you have 5,000 people in an auditorium or in a field. I don't know how they do it, but I think that 5,000 people are either on some kind of Republican mailing list or something, because it's very rare that you have situations where there's a group of people shouting, Bush lied, or one of the things that people shout. I mean, I think they must vet. These are all young Republicans, young students for Bush, or they are vetted somehow.
With the state party, and it would.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how they do it. The other thing which is interesting, which is something I found very surprising covering the campaign in 2000, was how they hold up. You see them all the time. These signs that look like they've been painted, Ohio for Bush, or so they look like they're like graffiti. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
All these signs. Do you know that they aren't graffiti at all? There's a whole process, a factory of people who are producing these signs. I mean, did you ever see it during the campaign?
Yes.
There's like
and they hand them out.
They hand them out to people in the crowds, and so you would be mistaken for thinking that all these people have been at home with their 6-year-old kid with a paintbrush and gone, "I love Bush," like this. But in fact, they're made en masse. I found that. I photographed that. I found it fascinating that that people are told, write like a 4-year-old, with your paintbrush. So that kind of thing. Yeah, controlled.
One more question, Towson.
I had a question for Charles. Since you said you came in blind to the American political system, I was wondering what you've learned about it and what you think the most positive aspects are and the most negative aspects.
Gosh.
You got a good job.
I think the positive aspects are obviously that people are genuinely interested in the process all across the country. I mean, I think where I'm from in Great Britain, people are very complacent and can't be bothered, and consequently it breeds kind of a political laziness in England, where our campaigns are the campaign for the Prime Minister is 2 to 3 months long. Really, I always enjoyed, for instance, when you go to Eastern Europe, how involved people were in the political process. You'd go to a cafe and you'd find 20 people sitting around drinking espresso, talking about politics, and that never happened in England, certainly not for me growing up. And I think one of the positive things with watching America in the election, I think people just taking a genuine interest in who their leader essentially is going to be. I mean, I think that's got to be positive. Negative. Negative only generally for me comes from myself, and it's like the negative aspects. Gosh, they're kind of like they're all usually things to do with myself. You know, they're usually I'm tired and I'm sick to death of hearing the same speech, and you know I become very cynical and
the repetitive and
controlled nature of it. You know, you can become quite cynical and unpleasant, and that's the only really negative side of doing this. You know, I can see. I don't know if you would agree. I mean, going back to the initial part of your question, though, coming from Europe, I think worked in my favour because I think I woke up every morning and I would go to bed every night, having seen something that perhaps, if you'd grown up with this whole process, you would have just not even noticed. You wouldn't have batted an eyelid. And Newsweek used to say to me that they used to find my pictures very funny because I would see things that I found hysterical. You know, that could be anything. You know, someone's diamond brooch, but I would find that I'd find that it would all be new to me, and I think that was one of the reasons, my motivating forces for being involved in this in any way at all. Does that kind of answer your question at all?
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate both of you coming for this last session. It was a very, very good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The nation and the world in a really neat and interesting way, but it didn't seem it didn't seem possible for me at the time.
Charles, can you tell us how you got into it?
Well, as you'll find out, I'm not nearly as serious as Brooks, but and our stories consequently are a little different. But I got into this game because the only place I could smoke at school was the dark room, and I of course could lock the door and tell the master that he couldn't come in because I was developing film, and we had a fan in there, so that was my start, and I consequently went on to be the director of photography at the school.
There was no combustible.
No, I had no chemicals out at all. I
didn't
even have a roll of film. I just had a packet of Marlboro Lights. But anyway, so that's how I got into it. But I woke up one day and I was 21 years old. I was just out of college. I'd done nothing to do with photography, but always had a love of it. And
where was the college?
I was at Edinburgh University in Scotland, and I'm English, as you can probably tell. I woke up one day after doing a fine art degree, which turned into a general actually in the second year, but that's another story. And wasn't really sure what I was going to do. I had travelled a little bit in Australia and Asia, and I knew I loved photography. And it was literally a wake-up call that I was broke and approaching 22 years old. And my father was on my case, you know, what are you going to do with your life and all that kind of stuff. And I was, what are the two things I enjoy doing syndrome was going on, and I knew I loved.
Good evening. Good evening. Tonight is our last session. Is our last session for the course White House Communications from the Perspective of Officials and Reporters. And tonight we have photographers, two photographers from the White House, Charles Ommanney of Newsweek and Brooks Kraft of Time. who have been competitors and friends since the 2000 election, and so each of them are going to show pictures, and they'll probably comment on each other's work, and we'll talk about how they do their work. And one of the aspects that we're going to look at are the public and private aspects of the presidency. And Brooks is going to show us a series of photographs that he did of pictures he took at the Bush Ranch one morning during, it was the Christmas vacation?
Yes.
And Charles is going to show us some pictures that he took on the campaign trail on the bus, following the bus last week.
Yeah,
Right.
just 24 hours.
So first, let's talk about how you both got into the business, how you became photographers, what kind of background you had coming to the White House for your news organizations.
I started in newspapers when while I was in college. I went to a liberal arts college, Wesleyan University, and worked. Ended up spending a lot more time working at the Hartford Courant than I did at Wesleyan University. And I was freelancing during the evening, especially during the evenings and the weekends, and just started doing more and more of that, and worked at several newspapers coming out of college, and actually became a fictional news type thing that was happening in my backyard, and I started shooting politics, and been doing it for about 10 years now.
That's very interesting. In looking at newspapers, when you were doing the newspaper photography, would you go from any kind of story? Like, would they send you out to take pictures of the mayor, and then take you, send you out to a school, just to a variety of things, so that the only thing that was in common was that you were taking pictures?
Yeah, you go. I mean, in a way, it's really attractive. I mean, if you think about it, because you can go from shooting sports to shooting the mayor to doing a portrait to just taking a nice picture out at a lake or on the beach. But I found the reality was that I was just constantly running. And now, of course, I'm constantly running at the White House, but at least I'm constantly running in one environment. But yeah, you do sort of jump from one thing to the other. And the other thing, which was a factor for me, was in newspapers, there's kind of a ceiling. There are a few newspapers in the country that are doing just phenomenal photojournalism, and have really, really talented staffs. But there's only a handful. And at the time that I was really getting into the business, it was actually very, very hard. Newspapers were, through the 70s and the 80s, were predominantly white and male. And it was very hard to get a job if you were a white male in newspapers. I mean, it was virtually impossible, for good reason. They were trying to diversify that. So there was, for me, there was also economic things pushing me away from, because at the time I didn't see any way that I could get the kind of newspaper job that I wanted. I mean, there are newspapers out there that cover their regions.
Photography, and I like traveling, so I was literally, what two things could have, as a job, could involve those, and started working as a postman, which is a god-awful job, and involves getting up at 3:45 in the morning and being chased by all manner of dogs.
But you can smoke the whole time.
I smoked, and I wore.
You could flick the butts of the dogs.
Do you know what I did? It was so damn cold in the west of England where I was a bloody postman, that I used to wear a fur hat from Russia. And I only found out after I'd been doing this wretched job for 6 months that it was the fur bloody hat that was causing all the dogs to go after me. But anyway, cut a long story short, I saved up enough money in about 7 months and bought an old, I'll never forget it because it was the most wonderful thing I'd always dreamt about having one of these Nikon F2s, which is the camera that Dennis Hopper had in Apocalypse Now. Now, it probably means nothing to a lot of you, but it was a big deal to me. Dennis Hopper and a black F2, coolest thing since sliced bread. Anyway, so I bought this camera, and I bought it from a little camera shop in Bath in the west of England, and saved up another 3 months. And when I was growing up, I won't take too long, but when I was growing up, I used to go on holiday to a place called Corfu in Greece.
Yeah.
It's a little island in the Aegean off the coast of Greece and mainland Greece. And when we used to sit on the beach, my father always used to point to this land, this very dark, kind of about 30 miles off the coast, this very dark mountainous landscape. And he used to say, you know, you never want to go over there. That's a bad place. And this was, of course, in the 70s when Hodja was ruling Albania. And this was Albania, which was this kind of very mysterious and you know...
Photo editor of a small newspaper up in Massachusetts, in Holyoke, Massachusetts. But I became increasingly frustrated with just the way newspapers operate, which is basically, for a photographer anyhow, you do 2, 3, 4, 5 things a day. You're running around. You spend 5 minutes taking a picture, then you're off to do something else. And they also, you know, newspapers tend to have a very literal approach to news. It's very, very content oriented. So the combination of just feeling kind of fragmented, and also I felt like the style of photography was I was interested in something that was a little bit more interpretive, a little bit more creative, a little bit less literal. So after about 3 or 4 years in newspapers, I went out freelance. And photographers, a lot of freelance photographers work through agencies. There's a whole system of agencies that operate out of New York and Paris that basically act as like giant syndication services for magazines around the world. That's how a lot of magazines get their images from agencies. So I started working through agencies, and then after that, developed relationships at some of the magazines, and around 96. Hooked up with Time and became a contributing photographer there. And at the time I was living in Boston, and one of the main things that happens up in New England is the New Hampshire primary. So I did a lot of political coverage. And in this business, you sort of get, it's very hard to, you get pigeonholed, you know, as a political photographer, or as a portrait photographer, or as a war photographer. I started out sort of by chance, just because it was sort of a national